Welcome back to Shadows of Black History, the channel where the forgotten dead are handed back their names and the stories they never taught you in school are dragged up into the light. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you are watching from tonight, your city, your country, and the hour on your clock. It always amazes us how far these stories travel. If tonight's story moves something in you, tap the like button and subscribe so it can reach someone else who needs to hear it. Tonight's story is true, and it is almost impossible to believe. In the spring of 1849, a man who had been born a slave did something no one in the history of the country had ever done to win his freedom. He did not run. He did not swim a river or hide in a wagon. He climbed into a wooden crate barely 3 feet long, a box smaller than a coffin, and he had himself nailed shut inside it, addressed like a parcel of dry goods and mailed 350 miles through slave country, by wagon, by railroad, by steamboat, right side up and upside down, for 27 hours in the dark, with a single flask of water and a few small holes for air. If the box was opened by the wrong hands, he would be dragged back into slavery or worse. If it was jostled the wrong way for too long, he would suffocate and no one would ever know. He bet his entire life on a wooden box and the United States mail. This is the story of Henry Brown, the man who mailed himself to freedom, and how he came out of that box and made the whole nation stare. The man in the tobacco factory. He was born around 1815 or 1816 on a plantation called the Hermitage in Louisa County, Virginia, one of a large family owned by a man named John Barrett, who had once been the mayor of Richmond. Henry Brown grew up believing, as a child does, that his family was permanent, that his mother and his brothers and sisters would always be near. Slavery taught him otherwise early. When his owner died, the enslaved people of that plantation were divided up among the heirs like furniture, and young Henry, about 15 years old, was sent into the city of Richmond to work in a tobacco factory owned by his new master. Richmond was one of the great slave-trading cities of the South, and the tobacco factories ran on enslaved labor. Henry worked there for years and became skilled at it. He was a big man, nearly 6 feet tall, around 200 pounds, quiet, capable, and deeply religious. He joined the First African Baptist Church in Richmond, and he sang in the choir there, and by every account he had a fine, strong voice. Remember that voice. It matters at the end of this story. For a while, inside the narrow room that slavery left him, Henry Brown built something like a life. He married a woman named Nancy, who was enslaved by a different master across the city. They had children, and by working extra hours and what the enslaved called overwork, the small money a man might be allowed to keep, Henry managed to rent a little house so his family could live together under one roof. It was a fragile thing, held together by his own 2 hands, and in the world he lived in, everything a man like Henry built was built on someone else's whim. Nancy and the children. The whim belonged to Nancy's owner. He knew Henry loved his family, and he understood exactly what that love was worth. So he used it. He let it be known that Nancy and the children could be sold at any moment, and that the only thing standing between the family and the auction block was money, Henry's money. So Henry paid. Year after year, he handed over his overwork earnings to keep his own wife and children from being sold, renting their safety the way he rented their house, never owning a single day of it, He did everything a man could do. He was faithful, he was hardworking, he was careful, he paid what he was told to pay. And it did not matter, because the one lesson slavery insisted on teaching again and again was that no amount of a black man's love or labor or obedience could buy his family out of another man's power. Henry Brown believed, or made himself believe, that if he kept paying, they would be safe. He was wrong. The day they took them, it happened in August of 1848. Without warning, Nancy's owners sold her and their 3 children, and Nancy was pregnant with a 4th, to a trader bound for North Carolina. The money Henry had paid had bought nothing. It had only marked him as a man who would pay. What Henry did next, he described himself years later, and it is one of the most haunting eyewitness accounts of slavery ever written down. He went and stood on the roadside in Richmond as the slave coffle, the long chained line of human beings being marched south to be sold, passed through the city. Hundreds of people, chained together, driven down the road on foot, and he watched, and he searched every face until he saw his own children going by in a wagon. And then he saw Nancy walking in that chained line, and she saw him, and for a few steps they reached for one another, and then the line moved on and carried her away, and he never saw his wife or his children again. He wrote later that in that moment his agony was complete, that the woman he had walked the journey of life beside and the little ones God had given them were torn from him forever, and that he was left to drag his chains through the world alone. Something in Henry Brown broke that day, and out of the break, something else grew, because a man who has already lost everything is a man who has nothing left to lose. And that, it turns out, is the most dangerous kind of man there is. The impossible idea. For months, Henry Brown was hollowed out with grief. He prayed. He asked God over and over to show him a way out of the country that had taken his family. And one day, he always said the idea came to him almost like a voice, like an answer. A thought arrived so strange and so simple that it sounded like madness. Get out of the South the way goods got out of the South, not as a man, as freight. Richmond shipped boxes north every single day as crates of tobacco, of dry goods, of merchandise, by wagon and rail and steamboat, up to the free cities of the North. Nobody searched a box. Nobody questioned a parcel. A box was invisible in a way a black man walking a road could never be. So Henry Brown asked himself the question that no enslaved person had ever answered in quite this way. What if he simply became the cargo? What if he mailed himself to freedom? It was insane. A grown man, 6 feet tall, folded into a crate for hundreds of miles at the mercy of every rough hand that loaded and unloaded it, unable to move, unable to call out, unable to do anything but hold still and breathe and pray. If he was discovered, it was the end. If the box was turned the wrong way, it might smother him. But Henry Brown had already buried his whole life. He decided the box was worth the risk. Freedom, he said, was worth more to him than his sanity. The conspirators, he could not do it alone. Someone had to build the box, someone had to ship it, and someone in the North had to be waiting to receive it and open it before he died inside. So Henry Brown did the most dangerous thing an enslaved man could do. He trusted people with his life. The first was a free black man named James Caesar Anthony Smith, a friend from Richmond who believed in the plan and threw himself into it. The second was a white shoemaker, Massachusetts-born, named Samuel Smith, no relation, who, for reasons of conscience, and some said for money, agreed to help. It was Samuel Smith who could do the one thing Henry and James could not. As a white man, he could walk into a shipping office and send a package north without anyone blinking. And there had to be someone on the other end. Through the abolitionist network, arrangements were made for the box to be received in Philadelphia by James Miller McKim, a leader of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, at their office on North 5th Street. Word was sent ahead. A very unusual parcel was coming, and it must be opened the moment it arrived. Everything now depended on timing, on secrecy, and on the nerve of one man willing to be sealed alive in a box. The box. They built it to be ordinary. That was the whole point. Anyone who glanced at it had to see nothing but freight. It was a plain wooden crate, roughly 3 feet long, 2.5 feet deep, and 2 feet wide. And Henry Brown was a 6-foot man. He would not be sitting in it so much as folded into it, knees to his chest, unable to straighten, unable to shift, for however long the journey took. The inside was lined with coarse woolen cloth called baize, a small mercy against the hard boards. There were 3 small holes bored for air. Henry carried in with him a single flask of water to drink and to cool his face if the heat grew unbearable, and by some accounts a small tool to bore more holes if he had to. On the outside, the crate was addressed to Philadelphia and marked in plain letters with the words that would decide whether he lived, "This side up with care." Those handlers could not read that a man was inside. They could only read the label, and over the next 27 hours, again and again, they would ignore it. Into the dark. On the morning of March the 23rd, 1849, Henry Brown climbed into the box. Before it was sealed, he knelt, and he prayed. Then his friends folded him down into that small dark space, fitted the lid over him, and drove the nails home. The hammer blows would have been the last clear sound of the free world before the shipping company's world took over. A man listening to himself, being nailed shut, choosing it, holding still. The crate was loaded onto a wagon and hauled through the streets of Richmond to the office of the Adams Express Company, the shipping firm that would carry him north. Somewhere in that city right then, he was still legally another man's property, being carried past the very tobacco factory where he had spent his years, past the roads where he had last seen his wife. And no one on those streets had the slightest idea that the heavy box of dry goods rolling by contained a living human being holding his breath, betting everything on the next 27 hours. The clock started. From here on, Henry Brown could do nothing but endure. The journey, part 1. The first horror came almost immediately. The box was thrown, not set, thrown onto the wagon and then into the baggage car, and it landed with Henry upside down, standing on his own head, his weight crushing down onto his neck and his temples. The label said, "This side up with care." It made no difference. He hung there, inverted, the blood pounding into his skull, his eyes feeling as though they would burst from their sockets, and he could do nothing. He could not cry out. He could not move. To make a sound was to be discovered, and to be discovered was to die a slave. So he stayed silent and prayed upside down for what felt like an eternity, until at last the box was handled again and he was turned. The train pulled out of Richmond and rattled north over the rails of the Richmond-Fredericksburg and Potomac line. Every jolt of the track drove into a body that could not brace itself. He was tipped, set on end, laid on his side, stacked with other freight, hauled off and hauled on at every transfer point along the route. And through all of it, he had to keep himself utterly still and utterly quiet, a living man playing dead cargo, listening to the voices of the very men who, if they knew what they were carrying, would have hauled him straight back to Richmond in chains. The journey, Part 2. The route was long, and it was cruel. From the railroad, the box was carried to Aquia Landing on the Potomac River and loaded onto a steamboat, and for that stretch he was again placed upside down, riding the water on his head, certain this time that he would not survive it. He later said he came close to giving up, that he felt the veins in his temples swelling near to bursting, and thought his death had finally come. 2 workers, looking for a place to sit, happened to tip his box over to use as a seat, and that accident alone turned him right side up and may have saved his life. He never knew their names. They never knew they had saved a man. On up the Potomac to Washington, off the boat, onto another wagon, dropped again, hard, onto the railroad, through Baltimore, one of the most dangerous slave-holding cities on the route. Hour after hour of darkness and thirst and cramp and terror, folded in a space too small to move, not knowing where he was, not knowing how much longer, only that if the lid came off in the wrong place, it was over. 27 hours, 350 miles. A man could measure that journey in miles, or he could measure it in the number of times Henry Brown decided again not to cry out, not to quit, to hold on for one more mile toward a city he had never seen. The resurrection on the morning of March 24th, 1849, the box was delivered at last to the office of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society in Philadelphia. A small group of abolitionists was waiting. James Miller McKim and a young black clerk named William Still, who would go on to become one of the greatest record keepers of the Underground Railroad. They had been told what might be inside. They also knew that what might be inside could just as easily be a corpse. They locked the door. They gathered around the crate, and, the story goes, someone rapped on the lid and asked quietly, "Is all right within?" And from inside the box came a voice, "All right." They pried the lid off, and Henry Brown, cramped, soaked, half dead but alive, rose up out of that box like a man rising out of a grave. Witnesses said the first thing he did was reach out his hand, and the first thing he said to a room of strangers who had just watched a man be born out of a wooden crate was, "How do you do, gentlemen?" And then, before he did anything else, Henry Brown kept a promise he had made to God inside that box. He had sworn that if he came through alive, the first thing he would do was sing a psalm of thanksgiving. So there, dripping and trembling in that Philadelphia office, he lifted that choir voice from the First African Baptist Church, and he sang the words of the 40th Psalm. "I waited patiently for the Lord, and he heard my cry. He had gone into the box a slave. He came out of it a free man. And from that day he took a new name to carry what he had done, Henry Box Brown." The famous man. The story exploded. It was too astonishing to keep quiet, and it swept through the abolitionist movement like fire. Within months, Henry Box Brown was one of the most famous formerly enslaved men in America. That same year, 1849, his story was published as The Narrative of Henry Box Brown, in his own account. He began to lecture across New England, standing before audiences and telling them, in that same strong voice, what slavery had done to his family and what a man would risk to be free. He wanted people not just to hear it, but to see it. So in 1850, he created something remarkable, a massive, moving panorama called Henry Box Brown's Mirror of Slavery, a huge series of painted scenes that scrolled before an audience like an early kind of film, carrying viewers through the whole brutal story of slavery from the coast of Africa to the auction block to his own escape. He turned his suffering into testimony, and his testimony into a spectacle that could reach people who would never read a pamphlet. But fame made him visible, and in a country that still called him property, being visible was dangerous. Exile and after. In 1850, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act, a law that turned every free state into hunting ground, that compelled Northern citizens to help capture escaped people and return them to the South. For a nationally famous fugitive like Henry Box Brown, it was a death sentence to his freedom. He was, in the eyes of the law, still owed to the men in Virginia, and now those men could legally reach into Philadelphia and drag him back. He was even attacked on the street. So Henry Box Brown got on a ship and sailed to England, and there he spent the next 25 years. He lectured across Britain against American slavery. He toured his panorama, and being a born showman, he reinvented himself again as a stage performer, a magician, a mesmerist, drawing crowds across the country. He remarried an English woman and had a daughter. In 1875, long after the Civil War had finally destroyed the institution that had stolen his first family, he returned to the United States and kept performing, an old showman still climbing on occasion out of a box on stage to remind audiences of the impossible thing he had once done for real. Henry Box Brown died on June 15, 1897, a free man in Toronto, Canada, nearly 50 years after he mailed himself out of bondage. What it means. It is easy to tell the story of Henry Box Brown as a clever trick, the man who beat slavery by mailing himself in a box. And it is that. But underneath the daring of it is something heavier and truer and worth sitting with. Henry Brown did the most desperate thing a human being can do because the country he lived in left him no ordinary door to walk through. He had done everything right. He had worked, he had paid, he had loved his family and tried to protect them. And slavery took them anyway, because slavery was built to make a black man's love and labor worthless against a white man's whim. The box was not just an escape, it was an indictment. A man had to fold his 6-foot body into a crate the size of a coffin and risk death by suffocation just to get something every human being is born owning, the right to belong to himself. And he chose it with his eyes open. He measured the darkness and the terror and the very real chance of dying alone in a box in a baggage car. And he decided that even that was better than one more day as another man's property. That is what freedom was worth. That is what it cost. Remember that the next time the word is used lightly. Outro and call to action. That is the true story of Henry Box Brown, the man who waited patiently, climbed into the dark, and mailed himself into history. Thank you for sitting with us tonight here on Shadows of Black History. If this story stayed with you, do us one kindness, like this video, and subscribe if you have not already, so we can keep giving these forgotten souls their names back. And before you go, tell us in the comments where you are watching from, your city, your country, and the hour on your clock. It never stops amazing us how far these stories reach. Remember, history is not only the things that were written down by the powerful, it is the things ordinary people dared and survived and refused to let be forgotten. Until the next story, keep your eyes open, keep the memory alive, and never let anyone tell you that freedom was ever cheap.